Matt. One book which I have found to be a great resource is The New Believers, subtitled Sex, Cults, and Alternative Religions by David V. Barrett. I wonder if you're familiar with it. He strives to be painstakingly fair-minded with all the organizations he writes about. Even so, the more wacky and dangerous ideas and practices of, for example, the flying saucer cults, the Nation of Islam, and of course, Scientology, come across loud and clear. Having learned so much from you about what really goes on, though, I do wonder about his use of a quote from Lorraine Bulger, who he says has reached OT8. Have you heard of her? He seems to suggest that because Hubbard's History of Man does not have to be taken literally, then a more metaphorical approach to the OT materials, notably OT3, would also be perfectly acceptable. The quote from Bulger reads, "Many religions have legends and scriptures which, taken out of context, can appear strange and misrepresentative. This puzzles me. I have detected no hint whatsoever of a move towards a more liberal reading of the core texts. In fact, top-level Scientologists aren't supposed to hint at their contents at all, right? Has the author perhaps got a little sidetracked here and managed to find some relatively easygoing independent Scientologists as sources? Maybe he is being a little too fair-minded. Your thoughts?" Thanks, Matt. This is a really great question. I'm really glad you're bringing this up because I'm going to get to talk about some things I haven't particularly talked about before with any of this. I have not actually heard of The New Believers, and it's a book I'll definitely look into. Such an array of material out there to get through. With all the suggestions I get, I've got a stack of books this high to get through. So I appreciate all the suggestions. I got a lot of reading to do. Now, as far as this question, though, okay, this is a really great example of something I have talked about before, which is an acceptable truth. Lorraine Bulger is an OT8, and according to what I found on Google, she is the executive director of the London Foundation Church of Scientology, which means she's in charge of it, one of the ideal orgs on the evenings and weekend schedules. That's what the foundation is. So she's a very active Scientologist, not an independent at all. The thing with acceptable truths is that, well, I actually looked up the policy on it, so let me actually read to you what L. Ron Hubbard had to say about it. Handling truth is a touchy business also. You don't have to tell everything you know. That would jam the comm line too. Tell an acceptable truth. Agreement with one's message is what PR is seeking to achieve. Thus, the message must compare to the personal experience of the audience. So PR becomes the technique of communicating an acceptable truth, and which will attain the desirable result. Okay? So what we've got here, and this is from L. Ron Hubbard. I just read to you from a policy letter, which is called The Missing Ingredient. He wrote that on 13 August 1970. So in Scientology, you're going to have, the reason why we talk about their deceptive practices and their lies is because you need a heads up on the fact that they're going to be, throwing some curveballs at you. And the reason they think that it's okay to do that is because of what I just read to you. They're trying to produce a desirable result in the person that they're telling these lies to. So they think of them as acceptable truths rather than lies. And in this case with Lorraine, she is telling, the author of the book here by David Barrett, that, hey, metaphorical, sure, absolutely, of course, right? I don't know that she used those terms. The quote that you quoted her as here is specifically, as you said, many religions have legends and scriptures which, taken out of context, can appear strange and misrepresentative. That's actually true. That's all by itself, that's a true statement. But if you then take that and apply it to Scientology, well, sure, you can take some of the things that, L. Ron Hubbard said out of context, and it can look even stranger and more bizarre than it really was. But if you look at the whole context, it's pretty strange and bizarre all by itself, right? And of course, that applies to the Xenu narrative and everything else. The confidential materials are absolutely expected to be believed and understood to be reality. an accurate reflection of objective reality, not a faith-based metaphysical metaphor. That is not what the OT levels are. L. Ron Hubbard didn't write those with the idea that he was telling all Scientologists a nice story. That was not where his head was at. And it wouldn't make any sense at all to do the auditing procedure of OT3, which involves telepathically connecting with the body thetans that make up your body or are glommed onto your body. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, check out South Park or look at my earlier videos about OT3 where I break it all down. These body thetans really exist, according to L. Ron Hubbard, in real time. They're right here, right now. They affect your thinking. They affect what you do. They affect what you believe. And so you have to audit them away. You have to release them, which means you got to wake them up spiritually and get them to snap to and go off and get their own body and go be an independent thetan again. That's the whole point of OT3. Actually, it's the whole point of OT3, 4, 5, the training that you do on OT6, and then it's the whole point of OT7. All of those levels exist to detect and handle body thetans. That's it. That's what they're doing. They're addressing them from different aspects. There's different procedures that are used, but basically that's what's going on. So there is no way that those body thetans, if they are a reality, could be a reality unless Hubbard's, actually there's lots of ways they could be a reality, but in Scientology, the way that they are explained is through the Xenu narrative. That's where all these body thetans came from. And in fact, Hubbard implies, or actually says in one place that I put in my book, that body thetans were not a unique phenomena to the OT3 Xenu narrative, that, when Lord Xenu blew everything up here on Earth, that wasn't the invention of body thetans. The phenomena had existed before in the universe, but it hadn't existed to such an extent, and to the trillions and trillions that fell prey to the genocide that was the Xenu narrative. So that whole crazy story is the backstory explanation for why it is that you have to do the auditing procedure of OT3 and then address them with drugs on OT4. It's called the OT drug rundown, but it's really just handling more body thetans. OT5, which is a whole series of rundowns, extensive amount of auditing that happens on OT5, but it's all addressing body thetans. And of course, OT6 is a training level where you learn how to audit OT7, and then OT7 takes years and years to get through. And every single day you are going in session 3 to 5 to 6 to 10 times, however many you can stand doing, but it has to be a minimum of, you have to go in session at least once a day, every single day of the week, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, you have to go in session. So, unless you get extreme special dispensation from the case supervisor. So, OT7 takes years to do, and you're going in session every single day doing it, addressing these body thetans. The only explanation Hubbard ever offered that I'm aware of for where all these body thetans came from is the Xenu genocide. So, that's why you have to accept it as literal truth. That's why I say that, right? You're not going to get... there's a lot of people, apparently, I didn't do OT3 when I was in the church, but everybody from Leah to Mary Kahn to other people who have spoken out about this, who have done these levels, have said that when you read the material and you're in the classroom, in the OT3 classroom, and you read it and you go, wow, that sounds pretty nuts, right? That sounds pretty crazy. They kind of expect a disbelieving, uncertain, whoa, what, kind of response. That's not unusual. But the pat reply for every one of them is, go in session, do the procedure, watch the e-meter, you'll see. The meter will respond and you'll feel better. Just trust us, just go do it, right? You don't have to believe all this just because it's written. I mean, you're supposed to, of course, right? And some people do. But for those who don't, they say, look, we get it, we understand, it's a little overwhelming, there's a lot to take in here, but trust us, go in session and you'll see. It totally is the way that Hubbard says it is. And apparently, with the auditing procedure and the way the meter works, the needle moves around in response to questions. And so they buy into that as the reason why it must be true, because, hey, the meter responded, so it must be true. And of course, their whole idea of how the e-meter works is totally wrong. So, of course, they're gonna assign false causation to the meter and to this whole story. So that's kind of the really big, long explanation for that. But I wanted to break that down that way because I want to make sure that everybody gets that it's not metaphorical. It's not a nice, fanciful story. These things that Hubbard wrote, including the stuff that he wrote in History of Man, was all supposed to have been objective, literal truth. Now, there is a way that you can invalidate some of the material in History of Man. History of Man was a book that L. Ron Hubbard wrote in 1952. The Xenu narrative is 1967. There's a lot in History of Man and in the years in between History of Man and the Xenu thing that's pretty wild and crazy stuff. He writes about heaven, he writes about helitrobus implants, he writes about intergalactic civilizations and invader forces and lots of things that happened to people in the distant far past that were unbelievably traumatizing and like really bad stuff. And he just made all this stuff up. I mean, it is some of the most fantastical stuff ever. It's really quite imaginative. History of Man is basically where we kind of look and go, okay, that's pretty much where all this fanciful stuff started back in 52. He wrote in there about Piltdown Man, which was a famous archaeological hoax. But at the time that Hubbard was writing History of Man, everybody believed it. It was still true. It hadn't been debunked yet. So that's still in there. There's also a lot of stuff in there about evolution. But later, in the 1960s, Hubbard wrote or said in one of his lectures that the whole thing about evolution and creatures evolving and all of that was just another implant. And that we all believed it because we were implanted and hypnotized in the far distant past to believe it. That's what these implants are all about. So, he sort of, when he said that, in the 1960s, it kind of invalidated a lot of the material from 1952, where he talked quite a bit about cellular lines and bodies and how you have a family line and you have this thing called a genetic entity, and there's all this rigmarole, which would just take me hours to explain all of it. So I'm just saying that there's a lot of hash in here that Hubbard sort of, threw out the back window in years later. And so Scientologists are not all a bunch of idiots. They can see how this line of information developed over the years and changed and morphed in some ways. And this is one of the ways that it changed. So that's how they can get away with talking about acceptable, like Lorraine Bolger here saying, yeah, you can take some of this stuff out of context from History of Man and go, wow, that sounds crazy. And yeah, it does sound crazy. But if you look at it in the bigger picture, it's even crazier. You see what I mean when I said at the very beginning here. So that's kind of a pretty full answer there. So no, I don't think that Barrett got taken in by any independent Scientologist. That's not what happened here. This was clearly set up by the church for her to talk to him. Otherwise, there's no way that some OT8 would just randomly talk to an author of a book where he's going to be writing about Scientology. They had to know about this. And they, they fed him these lines to make it sound like Scientology was more normal and acceptable than it really is. So there you go.